Pardon?
cracked open, but it hasn't been.
Oh,
Nobody's
okay, I'm
jumping at it over here.
Yeah, I think so. This room is. Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon. This is, can you hear me all right? Okay, great. I'm Diane McFarland. I'm Dean of the College of Journalism and Communications, and I want to thank you all so much for coming this afternoon for the launch symposium of the Consortium on Trust in Media and Technology. This is a huge topic worldwide, and we want to talk today about how UF can take a leadership role. We're going to spend most of the time exploring the deepening crisis of trust in democracy and consider what UF can do to address it. We are all living with trust issues now. It's a time when truth has been devalued and reality has been buried by an avalanche of misinformation and disinformation. Fake news is a term often used as a bludgeon, not a definition. Journalism has been hijacked by imposters. Trending is manufactured. Sinister algorithms can determine what we see and when we see it. Bots get as much credit for liking a story as we do. Images are easily corrupted, and perennial brands can be sullied overnight. Still, we are addicted to the information flow in ways we can't fully explain. And while a part of our brain tells us to beware, our emotions get the better of us, and we follow along and follow and follow. While trust in democracy's fundamental institutions is at an unprecedented low, we could be on the verge of losing our ability to trust these institutions at all. And what happens then? What creates a sense of urgency is the emergence of deep-fake technology. The specter of simulated reality looms even larger over the 2020 election than it did in 2016. For 18 years, the Edelman Trust Barometer has been tracking the level of trust among citizens of 28 countries. Of the 4 key institutions studied, business, government, media, and NGOs, government and media were the least trusted in the U.S., with trust in media declining by the greatest amount. And last month, the comprehensive 200-page report of the Knight Commission on Trust, Media, and Democracy was released. The report noted that, quote, by virtually every measure, Americans' trust in most of their democratic institutions, and particularly in the media, has declined dramatically over the past half-century. A confluence of economic, social, and political circumstances, along with technological advancements, has created a perfect storm that is destabilizing citizen trust in media and in other democratic institutions more generally. Today, you will learn more about the extent of this crisis, its causes and effects, and ways we might address it. But before I tell you more about UF's plans, I would like to welcome Provost Joe Glover, who will explain why UF is making an investment in the Consortium for Trust in Media and Technology. Joe?
Thank you, Diane. First of all, let me thank everyone who's come here to participate, all the members of the UF community, and all visitors to the UF campus. This is really important. I mean, it really is. I spend a lot of time talking to Diane about this. I have confidence that this is going to be one of the great things that UF does. As one of the nation's premier land-grant universities, UF has a special obligation to really advance the status of citizens in the state of Florida and in the nation, and in advancing really the state of the United States itself. We believe that we are one of a very few institutions in the United States that is equipped to do it by virtue of the fact that we are so comprehensive and that we have represented on this campus virtually every discipline. That is something that is truly rare, and we are trying increasingly to harness that advantage because we do believe it confers very special abilities upon us. In that spirit, we recently recommitted to the notion that the University of Florida should really put its emphasis, its brain power, its resources behind solving those problems and those issues that are really fundamental challenges to man, to the state, nation, and the world in general in the 21st century. And so last fall, we launched a call for a series of moonshots. That is, very difficult problems. Obviously, the term was inspired by man's race to the moon in the 1960s. That seemed like a very difficult technological feat, maybe almost unattainable. And in some ways, the fact that we landed a man on the moon was not as important as the technological journey and the sociological journey and the social journey that the nation underwent in order to land a man on the moon. That is, the spin-offs and what you learn along the way to achieving this almost incomprehensible achievement is worth as much or more than the achievement itself. And so we challenged the campus to propose moonshots, really difficult problems that would be of enormous interest and importance to the state and the nation, something that we could focus our resources on and work on for the next 5, 10 years. Maybe we wouldn't completely solve them, but these should be problems that are so intrinsically rich that we will learn a lot along the way, we will make a lot of progress, and we will fundamentally advance the state of our fellow citizens. So one of the proposals that was received by the group that reviewed them was this proposal for the consortium in trust. And it really struck everyone. There was a panel of people who evaluated these proposals. It immediately struck all of us as something that is really important for democracy and for all of our institutions, including higher education. By the way, higher education is one of those democratic institutions in which trust has significantly declined. But we believe in this moonshot. This is something that is absolutely important for the state and the nation. It is not a completely transparent problem. At least it's not completely transparent how to address this problem. And so I have no doubt that there will be a tremendous amount of really fundamental and groundbreaking research that's done through this consortium. But the potential benefits that are going to come out of this project are just unbelievable. I mean, Diane has mentioned a couple of ways that trust is eroding. From a personal point of view, I just find it amazing that what we're seeing right now in the country are resurgence of measles outbreaks, where children are becoming extremely sick and in some cases dying because the parents have not believed in the medical literature that vaccinations against measles and other childhood diseases are actually helpful and not harmful. I think this is a good example of a breakdown in trust which has really practical applications or practical implications for all that we do. And so I really do tell you that I have great faith that this moonshot will do really amazing things. I do thank you all for participating. I think this is something that is going to require all branches and all departments in the university to contribute from their own particular fields of expertise. But I think this has enormous implications, as I've already said, for the nation. I think it has tremendous potential for the University of Florida. I am sure that we and you are on the cutting edge of something that many other institutions will look at and say, gee, I wish we had thought of that first. So thank you all for doing this. You're probably tired of listening to me already, and so I will stop talking. But kudos to all of you, and congratulations, and rest assured that every semester I'm going to ask Diane, what have you done and where are you going? Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you so much, Joe. I feel like we could just end now and go to the drinks. That was really well done. Thank you. And thank you for the confidence and faith you've placed in us. The university has given us $1.25 million in seed funding to launch this moonshot. Of course, we'll have to raise a lot of money beyond that, but it's a wonderful, solid footing for the initiative. So we believe the crisis of trust is, because of its complexity, best addressed through a multiplicity of disciplines by a leading educational institution. We believe there is hope, and it resides in all of you. Research, both theoretical and applied, is key to addressing future impacts of technology on an informed society. This can't be effectively tackled in verticals. It must be a lateral endeavor, looking across disciplines at human behavior, social networks, technological applications, and the emergence of new policy and law. As digital technology and social networks become more integrated into our daily lives, trust and verifiability are issues that technologists shouldn't have to address alone. We believe that a collaboration of technologists with social scientists working in areas such as communications, anthropology, psychology, political science, medicine, and law can open up these issues to new discoveries and perspectives. Because of its comprehensiveness, UF is uniquely qualified to take the lead in doing work at the intersections of disciplines. Our mission is to foster a diverse community of scholars and thought leaders who will build an unparalleled ecosystem for the study of how media and technology can become more trustworthy, and develop programs for the application of new knowledge and tools and the creation of new policy and law. The founding partners are the College of Journalism and Communications, the Wertheim College of Engineering, the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, the Informatics Institute, George Smathers Libraries, and the Division of Student Services. We also have had preliminary discussions with IFAS Extension Services, the Colleges of Medicine, Nursing, Dentistry, and Public Health and Health Professions. Ultimately, we hope that every unit on campus will be affiliated. We are in the early stages of organizing the consortium around 4 pillars: media and communications, cognition and behavior, technology and platforms, and policy and law. Our breakout sessions at the end of this program will be organized around these topics. Again, it is important to keep in mind that we expect to do most of our work at the intersections of relevant science. We envision work that involves collaboration within the UF community as well as with scholars and experts around the world, the acceleration of new directions in research that illuminate the dynamics of trust in media and technology, curation of existing research to build an unparalleled repository of discoveries and best practices, development of trust-building technologies and monitoring systems, applied research and experimentation, involvement of world-renowned trust experts through a fellowship program, partnerships with major media and technology companies, thought leadership through the use of strategic communication, and curriculum and training to develop the next generation of trustworthy practitioners and civic-minded citizens. Now, this is very difficult to read, and I apologize for that, but I wanted you to see the scope. Already, there are more than 100 research projects at UF that deal with trust. Not all of them are directly relevant to this initiative, but we think that there are enough to provide a strong start for the consortium. The consortium's priority will be to provide an infrastructure to support your work. In addition to a full-time director, we hope to appoint faculty and staff who will provide support in the areas of education and outreach, research and academic development, and strategic communications. We hope to support visiting fellows and term professorships. We also will be providing seed funding, including a $50,000 pilot project program, which is being introduced today. Our plan is to host a trust summit each year, as well as various symposia. Today, you will hear more about the scope of the trust crisis and its root causes. Joining us are experts who are involved with other initiatives focused on this problem. Patricia Standridge is Senior Research Consultant for Gallup and working with Knight on their massive initiative around trust. Renee DiResta is Research Director at New Knowledge and Head of Policy at Data for Democracy. Joan Donovan is Director of the Technology and Social Change Research Project at Harvard's Shorenstein Center. Scott Hagedorn is the founding CEO of Heart and Science, and just last week was named CEO of Omnicom Media Group. And Josh Tucker is co-director of the Social Media and Political Participation Laboratory at NYU. Priscilla was supposed to be here in person. She left her home at 5:30 this morning, but missed her connection in Charlotte, North Carolina. So we are tapping her in by Zoom to kick off our program, and she will share the findings of the Knight Trust Media and Democracy Initiative, we hope.
Can you hear me okay? Okay. Well, I'm so pleased to be speaking to you today. Unfortunately, there was a technological failure that prevented me from making it this morning, ironically enough. But I am so pleased to have been invited to speak about this topic. As Diane mentioned, I am part of an initiative that Gallup is working on with Knight Foundation. We've already completed one research cycle, and we're heading very quickly into the second research cycle, which will also be 2 years in length. And I will also be leading this cycle. But what I want to do today is talk to you a little bit about some of the things that I feel are most relevant to the topic of the consortium of today. And that is around definitely trust in the media, and specifically the role of technology in shaping people's trust or hurting people's trust, and specifically in gaining people's trust. And as Diane mentioned, I'm a senior researcher here at Gallup. What Gallup really provides in this space, I think, is just the ability to collect vast amounts of data in a systematic way. And that's really what I'm going to be presenting to you today. It's part of a much larger research effort. I really invite you to visit the Knight Foundation website. There's a lot of resources there. We really conducted a lot of really great research there, and more to come. So just to get us started, I want to focus around a few key questions that we had definitely within the larger scope of our research agenda, but will really be guiding the discussion today. As Diane mentioned, definitely trust in the media has changed over the last 30 years. We want to understand a little bit more of how that's happened and where exactly people are losing trust. And overall, do Americans feel that it's easier or more difficult to parse information given the amount of news sources that are available to them? And then just overall, how do Americans feel about the way the face of news media has changed? There's been a lot of different types of sources, and just the way people access information has changed so much. And then, of course, top of mind is fake news. What is it? What do Americans think about it? And what do they think it does? And then, of course, when we think about fake news, we can't not think about major internet companies. Are they responsible? Does the public hold them responsible for identifying fake news and ensuring that it's not on their platforms? And then, of course, much larger problem is the algorithms that are used by major internet companies to decide what we see and what the public can see on a daily basis. So how do Americans feel about those algorithms? And jumping right into the key findings, which we'll go into more detail in the coming slides, it's definitely the case that Americans believe that it is harder to be well informed. We've seen this time and time again in a multitude of studies, and it's due to the number of sources and the lack of perceived objectivity. There's definitely a lot of problems around those topics. People are also very concerned about the threat of inaccurate information, the threat of fake news, but it's really interesting to see that people have very different definitions of what fake news actually is. And we'll get into that in more detail. But definitely Americans have conflicting feelings about major internet companies and what they should and should not be doing. They don't see the identification of fake news as their primary role, but it's hard to find really who is responsible. And then when respondents think about their own responsibility around fake news, we actually ask people if they have shared fake news, and we ask them why. So when the public then thinks about the aggregators and the pre-selection of the news stories that they see, they definitely see it as a problem. But once again, they're not quite sure how to define what the impact on society can be. And obviously, I think all of us feel that way in general. It's really a feeling that the academic community feels as well. And then overall, throughout all of this presentation, we do have to be cognizant of the fact that there is a polarization around political party affiliation in this country, and that ends up being a major dividing factor when we look at this information. And to give you some background, Gallup conducted a major panel study as well as a major mail study over the course of 2017 and 2018. What's important to note here is that all of these studies were self-administered. So when we think about any type of desirability bias that respondents might have been subject to when answering over the phone, we were really trying to minimize that. Some of these questions do put people a little bit on the spot in terms of their own responsibility. So when we think about these data, we can assume that people were answering the questions themselves without the intervention of an interviewer. And as again, I mentioned before, I would really invite you to go visit the Knight Foundation website if you have more questions about the methodology or even just about the wide range of questions that we've asked over the last 2 years. And you can also find the full reports on that site. So diving right in and thinking about bias and trust in the media, really just setting the tone for this conversation, we do see that over the last 30 years, Americans say that there is a great deal of political bias in coverage compared to 1989. There is a split there in terms of whether or not people feel that way if they're Democrats or Republicans. 2/3 of Republicans would say that there's a great deal of political bias compared to only 1 in 4 Democrats. And when we look at a slightly different question, asking people whether or not the media is doing a careful job in separating fact from opinion, we really see a reversal here. Compared to 1984, when people were fairly confident that the media was doing a good job on this front, really now people do not feel that way. They do not feel that the media is satisfying this fundamental role. And as a background piece of information, overwhelmingly, Americans do believe that the media is important to democracy. About 8 in 10 Americans feel that way. So when they say that it's failing on this front, it's a very serious issue. And then on a similar point, we ask people whether or not they feel that they are able to sort out facts or whether or not there's too much bias and not enough sources. And whereas in 1984, people definitely felt that there were enough sources and they were able to sort out facts, nowadays people feel a lot more ambivalent about that. And it's split about 50-50 on this point. So just continuing on sort of that trend, looking at sort of the different generations that we're seeing right now in the American public, we're definitely seeing that the loss of trust is among the younger demographics. And trust here is a composite based on a factor analysis that had a lot of different elements in it around perceptions overall, belief that the media was sorting out bias versus truth and things like that. But overall, we're definitely seeing that this will continue to be a problem in the future if these younger demographics continue to feel this way about the media overall. So how does the American public feel about navigating this new media landscape? When we break it down, once again, by those same age groups, we're definitely seeing that younger demographics are relying definitely more on online content. One thing that was surprising to me over the course of this study is I personally had no idea that people were getting news off Snapchat and Instagram. I just didn't even know that that was a possibility. Whereas we're definitely seeing older demographics that rely on more traditional methods, TV news, newspapers, talk shows. So there's definitely a split in terms of who is accessing sort of this new media landscape. And when we talk about also the differences by different levels of educational attainment, we also do see some differences here. People with a high school degree or some college tend to rely more on TV news, whereas people with a college degree or higher are more reliant on online content, and also seem to be postgraduates seem to be some of the few people that also are relying on print media. So we also asked people sort of thinking about these new types of information, things that did not exist essentially 30 years ago. We asked people about citizen videos, the internet overall, news aggregators, cable news. People generally have a positive view of these things. They think that they do have a positive impact on the news environment. But when we talk, we definitely see more negative opinions when we get into social media, and especially when we look at political leaders using social media. So social media definitely seems to be the sore spot here. And when we think about social media, inevitably we are thinking about fake news and the spread of fake news. And that brings us to basically understanding what is the public thinking about when they're talking about fake news. I know that there's definitely been efforts to define fake news and come up with a very clear understanding of what exactly it is and isn't. What we did is we created 4 different definitions that go from basically the most malicious type that you can think of, which is people knowingly portraying false information as if it were true, to a slightly less malicious type of misinformation around accurate news stories that are being cast, that are casting a political or politician group in a negative light. And what we see here is that people definitely think that all of the categories, no matter how stringent or how broad and less malicious, really, they do see these as fake news. So this was rather surprising to us. Even accurate stories that somehow have some type of negative light that they're casting on different political groups, those are also seen as fake news by a majority of the American public. We also do see a disparity here in terms of political affiliation. We do see that Republicans tend to feel more strongly that these types of definitions qualify as fake news compared to Democrats that tend to slant downwards as it moves down the spectrum of more malicious types of fake news. And interestingly enough, when we look at the political spectrum in terms of most liberal people to the most conservative people based on their own self-assessments, really liberals are the ones who feel the least strongly that fake news is a big threat to our democracy. They feel about half of them, 46%, feel that it's a serious threat to our democracy, whereas 75% of people who self-define themselves as very conservative feel that it's a serious threat to our democracy. So where do major internet companies come into play in all of this? Obviously, they play a major role in the way that people get access to fake news or where fake news is housed. 76% of Americans feel that major internet companies have an obligation to alert their users about fake news. This is something that definitely holds true across the political spectrum, but we definitely see much stronger feelings among postgraduates, Democrats, and people who have a generally favorable opinion of the news media. These categories do tend to have a lot of overlap, but these people do feel the most strongly that major internet companies have this obligation. But also thinking about sort of then who else what are the other responsibilities that these major internet companies have? We tried to ask the question a slightly different way. We asked them whether or not they thought any of these types of responsibilities were the most important responsibilities. And surprisingly here, identifying misinformation and biased news stories were not the most important responsibilities that respondents saw. So when we look at the types of responsibilities that respondents feel that the major internet companies have, protecting user privacy, preventing abuse and harassment of their users, really stand at the higher end of that scale. Whereas other types of things, such as identifying misinformation, news stories that contain inaccurate information, and biased news stories, which are presumably the least harmful, those really fall sort of at the other end of the spectrum. But we really wanted to understand where respondents place their responsibility. So we asked them, among these 3 groups, who really is the most responsible for making sure that major internet companies are giving people accurate and unbiased news? And definitely the biggest group of people really felt that the major internet companies are themselves responsible. A much smaller percentage felt that the government should intervene in this space. But really interestingly, a substantial portion of the population felt that people themselves, the users, are responsible for the content that is on the major internet company websites and apps. So that brings us really to the responsibility of the individual. And to better understand that, we did ask people whether or not, what do they do when they face misinformation online? We wanted to understand sort of what their thought process was. And somewhat disappointingly, people do say that in the vast majority of cases, they turn to news sources that they already use or they rely on internet web searches. So these tend to maybe make us think about those echo chambers where people are really just reverting to their own sources of information. But a promising percentage of people do say that they rely on independent fact-checking websites, and they do consult news sources from people that have a different perspective than their own. And then, of course, around half of people do say that they turn to friends or family to ask for advice. But what we really wanted to understand, once again, going back to the responsibility of the user, was whether or not people reported actually sharing fake news by their own choice. So we asked people that apart from articles that were clearly written as comedy or satire, whether or not they had shared news stories with other people that they suspected were misinformation. And once again, I think it's important to point out here that this is self-responded data. People might have some desirability bias involved, even though this is a self-reported study. But 23% of US adults reported that they had done this. I've looked at other studies that have tracked actual behavioral data around sharing behavior on Facebook or other things like that. And I think that I would love to hear, from other people in this group. But from what I've seen, the percentages based on actual reported data are much lower. So there's clearly something happening here where people feel more willing to volunteer this information, or perhaps their definition of misinformation is much broader. And we definitely see that there is a slightly higher percentage here of people who are sharing misinformation among Republicans and people who have a somewhat or very unfavorable opinion of the news media. And we wanted to understand why. Why do people share information that they knowingly believe is misinformation? So definitely here a little bit of respondent bias. Perhaps people said that they wanted to call attention to the story being inaccurate, or they wanted to ask for somebody's opinion about the story. My personal favorite here is that 21% of our respondents admitted that they had shared misinformation because they wanted to annoy or upset somebody. So I think that that's promising in terms of the honesty of this survey. But definitely moving on sort of to the broader issue at hand, when we think about curated content, Americans are aware of the fact that they are viewing curated content, but they really have mixed feelings about what this will actually do. So we asked them whether they thought it was a generally good idea or a generally bad idea that they are seeing curated information. And we see really mixed messages here. What is actually very pragmatic was that when we asked people why they thought they were seeing curated content, the vast majority of people said that they thought it was for business reasons. They didn't think that there was really some other strategy at hand. They really felt that it was related to the company's bottom line. Very small percentage of people thought that it had to do with some type of beneficial activity where, they were being shown things that were relevant to them or part of their communities or fostering some type of democratic process. That was a much lower motivation that was cited on this type of question. But when we asked them about whether or not they were concerned about the fact that these algorithms might exclude content from their news feeds, people were definitely very concerned about this. We're looking really at the top box response here, the percent that said that they were very concerned. Definitely the vast majority of people felt that they were afraid that this would give people a biased picture of the news. There were other types of negative externalities here that they thought about, such as increased influence of news that benefits the company, respecting certain points of view, the increase of certain news organization. But what's interesting to note here as well is that Democrats were definitely much more concerned about this than Democrats were. And when we also asked people whether or not they thought that displaying a particular news story was an indication that the major internet company was endorsing that story, the overall US population was fairly evenly balanced on this point, but we saw a really deep divide between how Democrats and Republicans viewed this type of activity. Democrats definitely felt that this was not an endorsement, whereas Republicans definitely felt that this was an endorsement of that story by a particular internet company. So ending sort of on a note of unity here, some of the points that overwhelmingly Americans do agree on is that major internet companies should disclose what these algorithms are. Close to 90% of respondents felt that this should be something that is part of the public domain. Another really interesting sort of really common ground that we found in this research was that close to 80% of Americans strongly or somewhat agree that major internet companies should be subject to the same rules and regulations as newspapers and broadcast news stations. The idea that major internet companies are not subject to these rules is very concerning to people. They really feel that there should be the same level of regulation and the types of regulations as traditional news media. And this was really shared by all the subgroups, regardless of political party or affiliation.
Priscilla, thank you so much. We are running a little tight on time, but I would like to take a few minutes for any questions that you might have for Priscilla.
Sure.
Thank you. Microphone coming to you so she can hear it. There you go.
Thank you. I'm Sylvia Chin Olmsted from the College of Journalism and Communications. Thank you for your presentation. I have a quick question about the motives of news consumption. In your research capacity or from your experience in the last few years, have you come across any significant changes in terms of why people consume news? We've just finished a study about fake news and news consumption. We found that people who actually they consume news for different reasons, and sometimes it's for entertainment more so than information. So in that capacity, maybe they would share or look at fake news in a different way. Have you come across anything along that line about why people consume news and how they might respond to news, fake news, in a different way?
That's a really interesting question, and I would love to hear more about that study. That wasn't really the primary focus that we were looking at. I don't think we had questions specifically about that, but that's definitely a very important consideration. There's a quote from our founder, George Gallup, about the biggest threat to democracy being a public that elects to be entertained as opposed to being informed. And I think that's definitely something that is front of mind for people. So I would love to know more about your research and sort of see if we can explore that avenue in our next cycle.
One more question? Anybody else have one they'd like to ask Priscilla? Priscilla, thank you so much. I'm so sorry you missed your flight this morning. We'd rather have you here in person, but we appreciate your time, and congratulations on the comprehensiveness of this project, and we look forward to future information coming from Gallup. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So now we're going to move to a panel discussion, and fortunately, we have Joan Donovan here with us. We also have two folks who are joining us by video conferencing. So the panel includes one academic, Joan Donovan, and two practitioners, Renee DiResta and Scott Hagedorn. Renee and Scott couldn't pull away from their work today, so they will be joining us remotely. Renee from California and Scott from New York. Joan, thank you so much for traveling to Gainesville. Their bios are in your program. Please take a moment to look at their impressive careers. Because this symposium is all about collaborations and team building, I want to introduce the speakers in terms of the intersections of their work. So Renee DiResta is working at the intersections of Russian and other state-sponsored disinformation, legitimate organizing versus inauthentic activity, detection and cybersecurity, and the role of digital advertising. Joan works at the intersections of domestic extremism and radicalization, social media and race, information and medical technology, technologies that degrade democracy and civil society, the role of algorithms, and how people determine veracity. Scott Hagedorn is a CEO working at the intersections of humans and technology, the psychology of persuasion, biometric intensity and mobile devices, fake news and intensity of attention, social media, and the future of advertising. Please give them a warm welcome. Hi, Scott and Renee.
Hi.
Hi. Oh, there you are. Great. Okay, I'm going to try to look at you through this laptop. So let's talk first about the spread of disinformation. What is the most alarming trend you're seeing? Joan, do you want to start with that?
So I have a few thoughts, but I'll stick with one. So prior to starting up this new post at Shorenstein at the Harvard Kennedy School, I wrote a paper with Anthony Nadler and Matt Crane. We're calling it Weaponizing the Digital Influence Machine. So taking insights from Sophia Noble's technological breakdown. Again, this one, check, no. No. Yes, no. Yes, no. Check again. Checking again. We're good. Okay, so wrote a paper with two very amazing scholars, one in the journalism field, Tony Nadler, the other a academic studying advertising technology online, and then me having my science studies sociology background. And together what we really focused on was some of the insights from Sophia Noble's work in Algorithms of Oppression, where she said very bluntly that the internet is not built for information, it's built for advertising. And as a result, when you turn an object on its head and you stop thinking about it in the way that a corporation or a brand or others want you to view it, and you view it for what it is, you see a lot of different things. And one of the things that I think was most striking in this report on weaponizing the digital influence machine is the degree to which stuff that we haven't been paying a lot of attention to, but we should, and cognitive behavioral scientists in this room will probably think this is, you know, really base 101 kind of knowledge, but the way in which the system is built is nudging us in certain directions towards information, away from other pieces online. And so we were looking at really about the interface and how the interface of social media, for instance, Facebook or Twitter, is changing the way that we view other organizations. So for instance, you get a content card that comes up and it says, here's a headline, very big and in bold, and you might click on that headline, and then someone will say, you know, and then you'll go out and you'll say, oh, I read this crazy thing on Facebook, you know, the Pope endorses Donald Trump, and you're like, where did you read that on Facebook? And they're like, yeah, but where did you get that information? And a lot of people can't think, you know, one link down and say, oh, I got that from some crazy imposter website, right? And so what we were noticing is that the information and the way that it's served to you is being maligned at the level of the infrastructure, which is different than saying, oh, you're just being tricked, or this is a one-on-one relationship to manipulation, but that entire groups of people are being targeted. And I think that the study that we just heard about here points also to this fantastic book called Networked Propaganda by Yochai Benkler, Rob Ferris, and Hal Roberts at the Berkman Center for Internet and Society, which says fundamentally a very similar thing, which is that certain media ecosystems are susceptible to this kind of problem, and that needs to be addressed.
Scott, I earlier announced your promotion that you were just named CEO of Omnicom, and that's all about advertising. So why don't you react to what Joan just said?
Yeah, I just want to check my audio. Is that okay for you guys?
We're having some heads nodding no.
Okay, I'll talk super loud then. Is that better?
Can you all hear him? Yes, they can hear you. Thanks, Scott.
Sure. What we're seeing a lot of, and just looking at it from a paid media perspective, is that, to the point that was just made, that a lot of the fake news is essentially ad supported, which is frightening, I think, for a lot of the clients. There was another round of it yesterday where there's a thing that we refer to called Kirchhoff's principle, where essentially the enemies know the system better than the creator. There was an issue yesterday, and it popped on Reddit, where there's a string of people that are looking at clips of children on YouTube and stringing them together in a way that would be almost like pedophiliac behavior. And a lot of that behavior itself was being supported by advertising. And what we are starting to look at pretty heavily on behalf of the clients is how much static is there in the system that we're supporting that is done by bad actors. And it's terrifying to think about. And for a lot of the brands that we support or other advertisers that we don't support, they move their money into digital, assuming that the same safeguards were around the editorial control that existed in the TV and print worlds for so long. In the world of television, no advertiser will advertise on a TV show unless it's been pre-watched and certified to be safe or within the content guidelines of that specific advertiser. In the case of the internet, those guidelines don't exist. And the way that internet advertising and digital advertising has actually evolved is it's separated by the nature of auction-based media systems, content from the context that it would appear next to. And that came out of the use of audience data to target advertising. And so audience data became the currency, and the context of where ads actually ran became something that wasn't looked at as much as it used to be in the past. Right now as an industry, we're just catching up to the fact that we're funding a lot of bad acting in the system, and that the systems themselves have a lot of vulnerabilities in them that can be exploited by bad actors.
So, Scott, what does this portend for the future of advertising?
I think just representing kind of the commercial side of the platforms, and as the dean knows, I've done work with Tristan Harris in the past, where we went back and forth between the commercial side of it and the ethical side of marketing and persuasion in the future, where you could be advertising around fake news. But I think it's almost a reset for advertising and paid advertising to understand the context that next to the content that you're going to be appearing towards, and also a kind of radical wake-up moment to look at how the actual system works and how the supply chain works for how marketing is purchased and activated, which has been up until on the digital side up until just a year ago pretty opaque.
Thank you, Scott. Renee, you've observed that the challenge is how to avoid throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Would you elaborate on that?
Yeah, so I work on state actors quite a bit. I wrote one of the Senate reports on Russia and the ways in which Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, all the platforms were manipulated by a hostile foreign actor that was using the system precisely as it was designed. So the accounts that they were creating, the mechanisms that they were using to grow the groups, this was really, in many ways, an extremely well-executed marketing campaign. And so how do we think about the fact that we have what's effectively a dual-use technology, something that has very legitimate uses? I have built pages myself on Facebook. I ran a pro-vaccine advocacy organization, and I used Facebook ads to grow a group to do very legitimate activism. So how do we think about protecting the rights, protecting the frameworks by which people can find their audience, find their tribe, think about activism, think about community building, while at the same time recognizing that these same tools can be misused? So a lot of the way that I have come to think about it over the last 4 years or so is almost as a cybersecurity problem. There are these kind of vulnerabilities that require a patch. There are ways in which the system can be co-opted, and how can we identify those ways, think about them much more proactively, and find ways to deal with inauthenticity, inauthentic distribution,
malign intent and the kind of quantitative signatures of malign intent to not require necessarily that the entire system be dismantled. It's my doorbell, I don't know who that is. And that's kind of
Alexander.
probably the mailman.
It's probably Amazon. You know? That's an inside joke. Renee and I know each other very well. And she's written one of the best articles to get buried last year on Amazon and how people manipulate their recommendation system. And so definitely Google it and keep searching for it, because I'm sure it got buried pretty far, because it was really one of the most interesting ways in which you can start to understand these systems is by doing digital ethnography and being sort of in the know as to how these systems are routinely being manipulated. And so I really respect Renee's work for that.
Great, thank you, Joan. She referred to community building. You've done a lot of work in that area. Tell us about that and what some of the learnings have been.
Yeah, so, goodness, I've been researching the internet for the last decade, and so we've seen a few different waves in which communities online have learned to communicate and coordinate. So it's the case that this event was booked and, circulated through online worlds. I'm sure you've been to many a birthday party that have been organized using Facebook events, and those same technologies are the things that we're increasingly using to organize our activism. And those mechanisms used to be really expensive, right? If you wanted to have people come to your rally, you'd have to print flyers, you'd have to go distribute them at a different rally or after an event or at the library. You really had to go out into the world and meet people and really try to bring them in. And as we saw through 2011 with the Occupy movement, in 2012 and 2013 with the Black Lives Matter movement, and as we saw in 2015 around Standing Rock, networked protest is really fundamental, I think, to changing the ways in which politicians carry on their work. And I think that politicians need pressure, and I think that the cost of networking social movements has come down pretty significantly. But the toll that movements have paid for this is that it's now very easy to astroturf online. It's very easy to become imposters. It's very easy to get your movement co-opted. And scientists, too, that have been implicated in some of the more contentious scientific work, like climate change, genetic testing, these kinds of things, vaccines, as well, have come under the same tactics. And so this is where some of Renee's and I's work crosses over, where we're really trying to understand how is good information bottlenecked online, good and true information, and then how are other groups able to leverage those bottlenecks or able to create scenarios in which disinformation or untrue information travels much faster. And so these are some of the challenges that we face as we want to grow communities, as we want to move into the digital and use all the benefits of those technologies, but at the same time, realizing that those benefits really open us up to a bunch of different vulnerabilities. And in that sense, I think it's a really interesting challenge, interdisciplinary, to come at this from many different angles. We've mentioned the advertising, but some of this stuff that I study, especially around white supremacist organizing online, mimics a lot of the things that I saw and was really hopeful for when I saw other organizations and other groups organizing online. And this presents a particular challenge for data scientists and computer scientists who are looking at behavior online and say, well, if they're just sharing links, what's the problem? Right? And we have to say, well, we have to look now at the content of those links. We have to assess the veracity of those links. And we have to understand that the technology we use to organize ourselves are the same technology that's going to be used to organize society. And we have to deal with inequalities, and we have to deal with hierarchies in the same way.
So Renee, why don't you pick up there and talk some about state-sponsored manipulation?
Yeah, so we've seen Russia is probably the most obvious. I can talk a little bit about what we saw in the data sets from the platforms. But I think it's important to realize that I'm going to talk about Russia because I've looked at it from the standpoint of things targeting the US. That's been my focus. And so that's primarily Russia and then Iran. But there's some excellent research by Sam Woolley and the Oxford team where they've gone into states that target their own people. So this was, for example, the Philippines campaign when Duterte was elected, a lot of manipulation of the social activism ecosystem to target internally, to be inwardly focused. So in the context of state-sponsored, first you're looking at which direction is it focused. Russia's Internet Research Agency started inwardly focused. So the earliest collection of the data set that the platforms provided, so Facebook, Twitter, Instagram as part of Facebook, and then Alphabet provided Google AdWords and YouTube data. So we had kind of 5 different independent collections of information. Many of the platforms provided it from 2015 on because that was what they were asked to provide, but Twitter was at first publicly chastened for not providing very much, and then in turn, after that, provided information as early as 2013. So we had very interesting insights into the operation of the Internet Research Agency on Twitter early, long before they focused on the US, and they were tweeting in Russian. They were tweeting to Russian audiences and to Ukrainian audiences, and they were talking about the annexation of Crimea and the downing of MH17. Those were 2 kind of common topics. So disinformation targeting their own people to project a particular point of view and to do what has come to be called manufactured consensus, to create the impression that this is what regular everyday people believe. What they did in the US was they divided American society into a series of, I would say 3 large groups, the left-leaning ecosystem, the right-leaning ecosystem, and then a very distinct cluster. On Facebook, it was about, 18 pages or so, targeting just the Black community. So the Black community was their own distinct operation. And what we saw there was really the facilitation of tribalism. So they were building tribes. It's often reported out as they're dividing society, and that is, of course, the goal of a disinformation campaign and active measures coming from Russia in general is how do you exploit real legitimate underlying grievances and kind of fractures in the American societal framework. But they were doing that by creating these pages that were really oriented around pride. So it was the majority of the posts were not political. The majority of the posts were to reinforce bonds in the audience. So content targeting Latin American communities was about how it's impossible for us to be illegal. This is our land. Targeting the Black community, it was a lot of cultural things, hair, skincare, family, just reinforcing elements of Black culture that are very core to people's identities. Targeting the Southern culture is what they called it, Confederate pride. This is my heritage. My people fought in the Civil War. And so each of these things is presented as, here is our tribe. And then the way that it's politicized, the way that after you've developed this relationship over a period of years, because they started in, again, 2014, 2015, it didn't become political until 2016. And what you see there is the framing of, as African Americans, we can't vote for Hillary Clinton. So it's again presented in the form of like, as a member of our tribe, as a person with this collection of beliefs, the natural way that we are going to think about this election is like this. And on the right, they really leaned into rage. It was just rile people up and get them out. I don't necessarily think they thought they were going to win. So they were actually already like in the process of calling for an armed insurrection after Hillary won. And they were telling things like, the Oath Keepers, which is a very real American organization, the Oath Keepers are going to show up to the polls to defend our integrity. They were telling Black people, this election isn't for us. They're killing us in our country. This isn't our country. We shouldn't even be out there voting. So you have the voter suppression narratives, which are not framed as outsiders telling people what they should think. It's framed as insiders, this is what we believe. And that's how the operation was designed.
So Scott, in your business, you certainly play on pride and tribes, but how do you navigate this distorted world?
Yeah, the scariest thing that we've encountered lately, when we were looking at just on the commercial side of marketing, and I don't know prior to this if the Dean and I have talked a lot about now the unique red thread around trust and accuracy and how it starts to tie together what have been church and state divisions between advertising and the press. But the scariest thing we saw, I'd say, in the last couple of years, fraud moved in our space from fraudulent ads that you could buy that were really targeted at nobody. About a year and a half ago, we started to clean up that part of the supply chain, which was further down. And the folks actually conducting the fraud, a lot of it was being done offshore by Russian companies and Russian operatives, started to hijack the identity of people on Facebook and on Twitter and Instagram and Pinterest. And when they did that, it originally started as a fraud mechanism where you could buy somebody and you were buying an audience that you thought was real, but it actually was just a bot of somebody's hijacked identity. About a year ago, the system figured out that those fake identities could actually broadcast information and opinion. And what started to happen was a lot of the hijacked identities, and this was in the probably 40 to 50 million range of hijacked identities on Facebook and Instagram and in some of the other social sites, started to broadcast as if they were a real person, opinions that weren't reflective of the person's identity that had been hijacked. And a lot then of those voices started being basically recirculated and spread and retweeted throughout the system as if it was coming from this individual. And when we started to uncover that in the data, and unless you have a cloud-based computing capability to be able to do that level of analysis and figure it out, when we started to see it, and we started working a lot of ad fraud companies like White Ops to uncover it, and it was basically an evolution of something that happened in our industry called MethBot. It was the same groups behind MethBot that actually did this. When we saw kind of the pervasiveness of the problem, it was terrifying. And it's a little bit unknown right now, but there's a completely opaque browsing technology that is hijacked a lot of people's browsers that is mirroring all of your browser behavior, copying it, but then behaving and starting to act in ways that you can only really pick up through machine learning, but is set to basically spread disinformation through social networking and platforms. And it was all built essentially around digital advertising ecosystems that weren't developed with the level of rigor to protect for and left vulnerabilities in the platforms that weren't predicted when they were originally created. I think they were originally created oftentimes with the best of intent. And I have a lot of conflicted opinions about this based on where I sit. I'm a Floridian, and my mom lives in Marco Island, Florida. And after the hurricane, their entire community in Naples and Marco Island organized using Facebook to help each other out. And you kind of I got to see the best side of the platform where they self-organized and people came to each other's aid and used the technology where everybody was interconnected to help each other out and to rebuild the community. On the flip side, the same kind of underlying approach can be used to be negative. But the scariest thing on our side now has been the identity fraud and what has happened with those fraudulent identities.
Thank you, Scott. So would love to involve all of you. Please, if you have a question, raise your hand. Yes, June. Right here. Hold on just a minute, June. We're going to bring a microphone over to you. Right. Raise your hand.
Hello, my name is Jian Shin. I'm here at Department of Telecommunication, University of Florida. John previously mentioned that, and also other speakers raised a similar concern that internet can be seen as a giant advertising machine. And Mark Zuckerberg recently wrote a column in Wall Street Journal defending their advertising model, where his point was, we provide free service, instead you get relevant advertisement. And when I ask my students, I'm teaching digital analytics this semester, I ask my students to think from both advertiser perspective and consumer's perspective, and then ask them to choose one over the other. Over 90% of my students chose convenience over privacy. And when they know the benefits and pitfalls of all these surveillance and data points they provide to these giant tech companies, and what could be, and this whole thing enables precise customer segmentation, and which makes it vulnerable to spread of misinformation. So what could be, given the situation, what could be the best solution? I know there's no one thing that could solve this whole thing. It's $1 million question, but what could be our answers? Would it be media literacy, or imposing some strict policies on these tech companies? I want to hear more about your thoughts.
Okay, so yeah, what's difficult about asking people about what they prefer is they don't always know the trade-offs, especially when it comes to, oh, well, in order to sell you those sneakers that you want, we need to know exactly where you live, exactly how much money you make, we need to know the colors you prefer, we want to know where you went to college. And I think at the last count I saw, Facebook collects over 60,000 points of information on each individual in order to target market to them. That's a lot of information to be collected in one place, and if it's your health information and they're going to target you with, they're going to see that, you know, maybe you make a post saying you're having trouble paying for certain medicines, and then you see those medicines getting marketed to you, or supplements so that you don't take those medicines, right? There's all these ways in which they don't understand. They'll post, oh, I hate paying my student loans, and then they don't see they get pulled into the cycle of these loan consolidation advertising. So there's a lot of things that you don't see that happens. And the targeting of vulnerabilities is really where a lot of marketers make their sales. And so there's one aspect of the problem there. But the advertising ecosystem writ large is an issue because of the way in which it structures all information online. And we were talking about this morning. One of the big things that I'm an advocate for is opening up the knowledge silos and saying, well, we've had a pretty decent push towards open access, and we've had all of the motivation to say, you know, knowledge for knowledge's sake, science for science sake. Now it's different, and I don't just say this because I married a librarian, but that we actually need to put librarians into the service of our digital information ecosphere for good, right? And we also need to make academic publishing a more well, we need to make it easier to access, especially for, not just for the sake of science, but journalists that I talk to that want to write on certain beats are often limited to preprints because they can't get access to the most, this is the medical people in here, the most up-to-date information, right? That's a very expensive database, up-to-date. And then the second thing I would just say is that we also need to think about the responsible scaling of these platforms. It's not the case that I can just buy a bunch of planes and decide that because, you know, Miami Airport exists that I can land them there. And we have to think about, can these platforms provide the services they say they're going to provide at scale? And we know in one place that they can't is definitely around political advertising and political communication, because that vulnerability is something that is going to be exploited for not just elections to come, but we're seeing it more and more in smaller races, the advertising infrastructure having much more impact, an outsized impact on decisions that small towns are making, not just in the big elections. And so those are the two main things that I would suggest.
So a quick question in terms of taxonomies. I guess the general public now knows what spam is, what phishing email is, and things like that. And it took a while for email to get classified under those buckets. Is there anything that technology companies or a push for something to be happening in the social media world to develop these taxonomies and larger algorithms. I know all these companies are very protective of the algorithms, but they should also have the mandate to classify anything that would fall under those categories. Is there any research for push for that, or is there some advancement going on in development in those areas?
So which of our panelists would like to field that one?
Can you summarize it really quickly?
Yeah, that'd be helpful.
They were just asking about the cybersecurity issues. Is there a way, Facebook sometimes talks about misinformation as a problem of spam, but is there a way or a taxonomy that platforms should be thinking about in terms of information and cybersecurity so that we can develop a field around this?
Yeah, so I think a little bit to that, I think, in terms of how how communications have progressed since the 2016 election. Coordinated inauthentic activity is the term Facebook uses now, and that actually did come out of conversations with third-party researchers and others who said that, per Joan's point, you do have to look at the content, but there are things you can look at before you look at the content, and that's things like how is the information transmitted? How is are these accounts all linked by a shared AdWords account? Is it a merchandise ring where they're all pushing the same kind of stuff? We did come together as an industry to think about how to deal with spam. And that did involve things like transmission of information about domains that were low quality. It's interesting because that has been politicized at this point. The idea that something would be called a low quality domain, you hear the howl goes up from whichever political side feels that they've been wronged when something is labeled a low quality domain. But this is not a new concept. This is something that that has existed actually in cybersecurity for quite some time, which is why I do advocate for thinking about it in those terms. Coordinated inauthentic activity looks at both the original account activity, per Jason's point about commenting identities, recycling. There's actually a black market where you can go out and buy, buy fake Facebook profiles and things, buy Instagram clicks, buy YouTube watches, botting the system. So thinking about where is the traffic coming from? What does the metadata look like? How are these accounts linked? What are the age of the accounts? There's a lot of things, a lot of signals that we can use to kind of move the ball forward without even getting to what are they saying. Once you get to what are they saying, you get bogged down in the conversation about truth and narrative, in my opinion. And so where's the low-hanging fruit that we can get to first?
I think that the crazy thing in the system that we have to deal with is that I think a lot of folks assume that there is an AI capability that's automatically scanning all the content that exists that's being monetized or created for advertising, or the content that it's appearing adjacent to that's able to classify it. And the majority of the content that exists on the internet has been classified through metadata that's been created by a person, and it's not created through any AI or any scanning. Facebook, up until still now, doesn't have the ability to scan anything but a static image, and the computer vision relative to AI to structure what the content actually is doesn't exist to create a metadata scheme around it. And in the case of all of it, unless the content itself has been flagged by a viewer or a community member as being fraudulent or offensive, then it's not ever reviewed. And that has not changed over the last 3 years and will not change before the next election cycle. And then the teams at Facebook and the teams at Google and these other platforms, not to vilify them, and I realize that we're talking a lot about Russia, and that I look like, now I look at the camera, the severed head of Rasputin floating black turtleneck. But there's no capability right now manually for that content to be reviewed. The answer has been we're going to add teams offshore to be able to review that content, but those teams oftentimes have no understanding of the context of what they're looking at and whether or not it's offensive compared or inaccurate compared to the setting that it's supposed to be appearing in.
So let's pivot just a little bit and talk some about deepfakes, simulated content, and the 2020 election. What do you foresee, and are there detection tools being developed that can help us manage this process as a country? What are your thoughts about that?
I think it's gotten a lot harder. I'll point to two things from the last week or two. There's that site, thispersondoesn'texist.com, I think is what it's called, or is that the name of it? Thispersonisn'treal.com, maybe. Google it. It's basically GAN's technology that kind of is creating incredibly realistic looking human faces. One of the ways that we look to see if when you're kind of checking the authenticity of the account is like, did they recycle the photo from somewhere? Is it a stock photo? Is it a photo that exists in a Facebook database where, there is the ability to say, this person's face appears in this profile, that kind of thing. Once you have these generated faces, that becomes a lot harder to do. At the same time, also last week was the OpenAI text, the text that they put out that was produced by their AI, which is remarkably sophisticated. It reads like real content. And so another thing that we've always looked at is like, is the content being recycled from somewhere? Is the content being, co-opted? Is it obviously crap? Is it obviously ESL? And what we see now is the ability to just generate this material has outpaced our ability to detect it. So it's an arms race, and that's another reason why when I kind of beat the drum on cybersecurity problem, it's that you are always going to have adversarial actors who are always going to be using the latest technology and the cutting edge stuff. We develop the capability to create it before we develop the capability necessarily to detect it. So this is something that I think as people develop these tools, is there going to be a repository somewhere where every face that has ever appeared on thispersondoesn'texist.com, like, lives in some library so that we can, check and see if that's where it came from. These sorts of things. But ultimately, people are going to run their own. They're not going to appear online anywhere, and you're going to have to figure out if a person is real or not. So there's a lot of that challenge. We thought that chatbots and deepfakes and things like that were, I would say 3 to 5 years out, but it really is improving quite rapidly.
I guess I just would give a short definition. Way to think about this is the deep things, audio or video or images that are generated completely by machine learning. So it's an event that never happened, a conversation that never occurred, a person that never existed, and this presents really sticky challenges for us as researchers. I worked on a report with Amelia Acker, who's a prof over at UT Austin last year that came out at Data and Society called Datacraft. And within it is a checklist of things you should look at if you're trying to authenticate content. We made it mainly for journalists and researchers to say, okay, if I think it's fabricated content, if I think there's something manipulated here, how do I understand it from the signals that are around it? So, of course, looking at timestamps, looking at the Internet Archive, trying to get a sense of these things. And, of course, the easiest way to figure out if something is manipulated is to look at the picture of the avatar and see if it's been recycled or reused. What's difficult is, while we can dream up any idea about what it might look like for the White House to be exploded, right? And this has played out on millions of TV screens for the last, since we got CGI, right, and before. The context has changed, right? The fear is that this stuff is going to appear on social media, it's going to be instantaneous, and it's going to trouble the stock market, it's going to trigger a war, or it's going to enrage a movement. And this is highly problematic, but where we actually see the most damage being done in terms of deepfakes is related to individual harms where pornography is being created of acts that have never occurred, and it's being used to harass certain women. And there's Reddit communities that have been dedicated to this and removed. And so one of the things that we have to be cautious about is, of course, we can dream with our sci-fi and our technology, but we also have to understand that there's going to be real-world harms from this. The fallout from this can be really, really traumatic. especially for people who, you know, we've already seen some of the aftermath of revenge porn. And that kind of harassment is real. And so when I worry about deep fakes, I'm often torn between, oh, it feels like fantasy, we'll never get there. And then I've seen some of the ways in which it's been used, and then I realize, oh, you know, people who are already what Sophia Noble calls the digital disposable are going to be re-victimized by this kind of technology. And so I think it's something that we need to think about and legislate quickly, so that, and that we need to build technology to detect the technology, because it's going to be a really, you know, the people who are going to suffer most are the people who aren't going to be able to defend themselves.
So we just have a few minutes left, and I want to do a couple of things that are somewhat self-serving. One, Scott, is you've offered to enable a pipeline, access to data to help understand advertising data. I would love for you to tell us more about that in case anyone in the room would be interested in that. And lastly, I would like for the three of you, as sort of a transition to Josh Tucker's presentation, to talk about the gaps in knowledge and where you think research and development could yield the greatest results. So Scott, would you take just a minute or two and talk about what you have in mind, and then we'll go to the more general question.
Yeah, certainly. I operate a cloud-based data platform with APIs into most of the ecosystems that we've been talking today. And the interesting thing is that the open APIs that were put in place by a lot of the social networking companies were not done with ill intent, but that's how ultimately the data was utilized. And we operate a cloud-based environment where we have most of that data in a structured or unstructured way if you're able to write your own queries and code. And if there's any students out there that want to experiment with this data and this event level data environment, we can give you access to the buckets of the data, and we can help you to structure it in a way you can analyze it and maybe come up with some insights or some experiments of your own. And I make that available. And if it's of any interest, let us know. We also, you know, we have census level data environments of the US that we use for that are anonymized, but we use for building these types of currencies. So if you ever wanted to explore the way that some of these behavioral targeting clusters or tribes are developed, we also have those data things at the ready to experiment with, so that you could see how this happens both for good and for evil. You know, as you're thinking or maybe transitioning to the future and the next spot of it, if you haven't seen the Google Duplex demo on YouTube of the next wave of AI-enabled voice and AI-enabled assistants, that's the evolution of smart speakers and where the technology is going, you should check out the demo, because you'll be able to see a glimpse into the future of what the next election cycle would look like. The thing that we're grappling with, I think, on the commercial side, on what are really the next boundaries of persuasion and ethical persuasion. This whole argument that we're having today, or discussion that we're having today, is who gets to give somebody an opinion and who doesn't. And what happens when that opinion is coming from an actor that's not allowed to be those that are allowed to persuade. And the crazy thing now is that technology itself is being allowed to persuade. And what will the boundaries look like for that? And how does that impact journalism and advertising and communications in the future is something that we should all be thinking more about.
You want me to weigh in on the future?
Yes.
Yeah. So one of the things that I've really been struggling with in this field is understanding the way in which we've built an information environment using the internet and how platforms have managed to become synonymous with the internet itself. But that we have this vast decentralized architecture for people to put up their own web pages, to host their own videos, music, culture, really, and it's really being underutilized. So we have this vast infrastructure that's being underutilized, but people built platforms on top of it that are really easy to use. And so as a result, we keep going back to them, even though we hear stories after stories after stories about how they're doing damage and how we must accommodate, or we must turn ourselves over to it so that we can keep getting the benefits of it. And I just don't think that's a really fair way to run communication, which, you know, in the very Stuart Brandian way of saying things, you know, information wants to be free. But I really think that knowledge is very expensive. And it takes a lot of work, and it takes a lot of people, and it takes a concerted effort, right? Knowledge has important coordination mechanisms built into it. And I think that as we start to re-envision platforms and social media, we also have to rethink scientific communication, and we have to rethink the ways in which journalists have now come to fill in for so many more professions than they've ever really should have been stuck with. You know, journalists have to be able to assess, you know, the accountability of the person that they're interviewing. They have to be able to assess the content that they're circulating. They have to be able to critique everything that they read and take in, and at the same time, they have to be good stewards of information, as well as moral, ethical, and responsible human beings. And I think that we want to hold on to some of the really important and good things that journalists have been able to do, but we need to fundamentally also rethink the funding model of journalism, as well as the relationship that journalists have to expertise. And we need to have our experts really step up and step into that role and help journalists with these more difficult beats, and with the vast array of bad actors that are coming at them from all different kinds of angles that they never really anticipated. You know, most journalists don't think, oh, I'm going to sign into Twitter today and possibly get, you know, harassed, or I'm going to sign into Twitter today and there's going to be 15 people that try to convince me of a hoax and, you know, and make me think that it's a lead. And so journalists are really under attack because they've become such an important set of watchdogs in our society. And I think that academics, our role here is to step up and give them the expertise and give them the help that they need to make sure that their beats are solid, as well that we need also to hold these platform companies to account for some of that. And unfortunately, where we're seeing the most action is within the EU right now, and some of the net laws in Germany. We're seeing other governments worry about the relationship of information to society. And I think that our policymakers, too, have got a long way to go to get these platforms in check. Yeah, so I think I'll leave it there, but I do believe that academics have a really important role to play as undergirding and changing the fundamental infrastructure of the internet, whether it's through our technical capacity or our knowledge capacity, but that it's up to us to make sure that the things that we learn and the things that we write are freely available, and that people who are going to need that knowledge have it at their fingertips. And we can do that with Facebook if we wanted to.
Thank you, Joan. Renee, we've gone over a few minutes, but I would like you to chime in on this. And would you please include your comment to me earlier that education is the best inoculation? Would you talk about that?
In terms of concerns, the thing that I'm most interested in from a research standpoint is the thing I have never been able to get my hands on, which is any kind of data for quantifying impact. I know that advertisers, you know, they also talk about, oh, I know people are seeing my ads, but are they converting? You know, what makes them convert? I'm very interested in that as a question. I'm very interested. The one thing no platform gave me when I was doing the Russia project was information on how people reacted. I could see 900 comments as the, you know, the statistic attached to the post, but I couldn't see what anybody was saying. And that, I think, is the piece that, you know, I'm dying to know, do these tribal affiliations, what kind of communities do these, what kind of communities can these malign actors create? What is the response to seeing memes about voter suppression? I don't have any visibility into that. And I think that with that, there's a greater sense of, is there a profound responsibility here, or is this preaching to the choir? And how can we think a little bit more about influence online, influence and conversion, basically, are the two areas that I've been really interested in. And then you wanted me to talk about the education piece, right? I think, drawing on like Brendan Newman's work and others, there is a sense that oftentimes people will have their minds made up, but one of the interesting things about recommendation engines in particular is that we're seeing new conspiracy theories kind of pushed at people who are a member of one conspiratorial community. And one of the interesting things is that their first exposure to these new topics comes not from an authoritative or scientific source, per Joan's point, but from another kind of tribally aligned manipulative group. And is there a way to say, in the interest of curation, can we get there as a society where we say, when the platforms are acting as curators, they should be held to a higher standard of care, such that when someone goes looking for information, they see high quality information. This is a thing that Google search does, but YouTube doesn't, which is a very interesting divide in how the two respective kind of subsets of the same company see their role in society. Google search has this thing called Your Money or Your Life, where it's saying, when you search for health or financial information, we should serve you up something recognizing the gravity of the search. This is what Joan was talking about with librarians too, right? A librarian's not going to give you a quack book on juice fasts to cure your cancer. They're going to give you a real book. How can we think about ways in which information is provided to people in a more responsible way? And then the other piece of this is, how do you help people realize that there is this vast swath of manipulative, malign activity happening, and can you make them more inclined to be more thoughtful consumers of the information that they are given? So kind of two sides.
This was wonderful, so illuminating. Thank you, Joan, Renee, and Scott. Could talk with you all night. Unfortunately, we don't have all night, so we'll end it here. Please, everyone, if you would, give them a round of applause. Thank you. So our next speaker is Joshua Tucker from NYU. Josh works at the intersections of social media and political participation, Russian influence, interdisciplinary work outside of the box, computational social science and biology, and how to make data and science more accessible to the public. He inspired the Monkey Cage blog in the Washington Post on how to communicate science to a broader public, and today he'll be talking about key research questions and data gaps. Josh, welcome. Josh, you have muted. There you go. Nope. Can you do a test, Josh?
Yes, can you hear me okay
Yeah,
now?
great. We can hear you.
Sorry, I got brought in very late into the conference, so I'm just getting ready to share my slides now.
Okay. Welcome.
Okay, can you see the slides now at this point?
Yes.
All right, and that's all you should see, right? You're not seeing any more on my desktop?
We're seeing a lot there.
All right. Okay, that should be just the slides up there right now at the moment. Okay. All right. Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here today, and thanks for inviting me to participate. What I'm going to talk to you about today is a review that we wrote that I coordinated and pulled together a great bunch of people to write for the Hewlett Foundation last year. And what we were asked to do was try to to try to address the current state of the literature on social media, political polarization, and political disinformation. So everything I'm going to talk to you about right now, you can download from the Hewlett Foundation. You can also download it from SSRN. I'll leave you at the end with a link to this on your screen. What we did in the review was the following. This is what we were asked to do. The review starts with a sort of conceptual framework for thinking about ways to link together these questions of social media, disinformation, and political polarization. And then what we present is a literature review, a set of 6 literature reviews on sort of what we know at the moment on these 6 different topics. So we look at online political conversation, consequences of exposure to disinformation, producers of disinformation, strategies and tactics of spreading disinformation, online content and polarization, and then misinformation, polarization, and democracy. So there are about 6 to 8 pages of reviews on each of those topics. And actually, I'm pleased to announce we're working on at the moment of turning this into a book that will be available in about a year that will sort of blow these reviews up a great deal and also extend them more into the future and accompany with other topics as well. But what I'm going to talk to you about today, what I was asked to do here, was to discuss these final 2 parts of the report. So at the end of the report, there are about 20 pages or so at the end of the report. We look at what are the key research gaps across all of these topics, as well as what are the key data gaps that we need to address these research gaps. And given that all of you are at this point in time thinking about embarking on a sort of massive research agenda to try to get at many of these topics, we thought that we would share today a little bit of what we identified there. So that's what I'm going to talk to you about here in the remaining 10 minutes or so. So I want to start, there's a number of different areas of research gaps that we identified. But one of the sort of first and most fundamental points that comes up when you start looking at this is that there's just some basic underlying knowledge that we're sort of missing in this area. And not surprisingly, given how fast things have changed and developed, if we think in comparison to similar periods of time across history. But we start with definitions. One of the things that we want to talk about is whether online conversations of nature X are increasing. So are there more acrimonious conversations? Are there more conversations that are going on across partisan lines or within partisan echo chambers? And one of the first things we discovered is that there's not even a sort of clear, consistent definition of what an online conversation is. Right? Does this involve 2 people talking to each other? Does it involve multiple people talking to each other? Does it have to go back and forth more than once? So there's some basic fundamental kind of definitional information here. When you get into the study of disinformation, which a lot of us have been spending a lot of time on here, one of the very first questions, of course, you get asked is, well, what is disinformation? What is fake news, right? And there's a lot of work people are trying to think through, thinking about ideas of differentiating disinformation as deliberately spread incorrect information versus misinformation that may be non-deliberately not known to be true when it's spread, untrue when it's spread. Anyway, so we need definitions of disinformation. We also constantly find ourselves trying to talk about what we mean by media and how we can classify media into different groups. There's a lot of discussion of mainstream media versus fake news media, which seems like something that might be fairly easy to classify. But then where do you draw the lines with things like hyper-partisan media? So we are looking for these kind of classifiers that are out there. And then finally, we need good definitions of online actors. We've put some out in our work trying to differentiate bots from trolls from cyborgs, but there are a lot of different terms who are floating around here. So I think this is one area that when you sort of jump into this world, we need to be thinking about. The other thing is that we're missing kind of really basic descriptive information about prevalence of phenomenon. We do see more and more work with counts. Of course, counts of anything are going to be dependent on what you have of defining them, but counts are often not accompanied by denominators. So when we think about saying that there's a lot of something, what do we mean by saying there's a lot of something? So we want to know not just counts of phenomena, but we also want to know proportions. And actually, when you're dealing with online environments that are massively huge, when you're dealing with social media platforms, getting denominators can turn out to be much, much more tricky than getting numerators. And it can make a big difference if you think something is 10% of what people are consuming, or if it's 1% of what people are consuming, or if it's 70% of what people are consuming. The next thing we want to think about as well are trends over time. It can be very tempting when you're dealing with these kind of large-scale digital phenomenon to zoom in very tightly, because we now have the ability to find evidence of phenomenon X that we care about, with lots of great examples of it, because social media data is optimized for search. So you can go looking for something that you might think is pernicious. You can go find examples of something that might be pernicious. And if you combine that with the fact that on social media, lots of phenomenon seem like they're bursty, so they spike really quickly, but then come back to underlying base trends, it can actually be really dangerous to kind of zoom in too closely, because you can see an increase in something, but then over time, if you zoom back out of it, you'll miss the fact, unless you zoom back out of it, you'll miss the fact that that was just a burst, not a change. And actually doing trends over time can be much, much more complicated than just getting these sort of short-term pictures. So we want to learn, we're going to need things about prevalence of phenomena as well. The next thing that comes out is that there's been a ton of work where people have been trying to measure how much disinformation is out there. And one of the things that we've been, as we've been thinking about, a bunch of us who are working in this disinformation sphere have been thinking about a lot lately, is the need to kind of begin to think about how we disaggregate this question of the impact of disinformation. So when we are thinking about disinformation and disinformation flows in the political process, I find it helpful to think about this as sort of 4 separate questions. One of these questions is, who's producing disinformation? We seem to have learned quite a bit about this for the 2016 US presidential elections. A second question is, who's exposed to that disinformation? We've learned a lot more about this in the last, few months. The third question is, who shares disinformation? So who transmits disinformation? We've learned a bit more about that recently. But then, in a sense, this all builds up to the larger question of, well, what's the effect of being exposed to disinformation? And it turns out we don't really know much about this at all. Right? There's a lot of assumptions out there that this is bad, and there's a lot of reasons that we can think this is potentially bad, and we can think it's mitigated by the fact of the exposure levels being higher and lower. If we think there are pernicious effects of being exposed to disinformation, then that should probably be worse when when you're exposed to more disinformation. But again, we don't really know what the effect of being exposed to any disinformation is on individuals. And if it's things that we care about are things like vote choices, and we happen to know that 90% of, I believe it's 90% of Republicans voted for Donald Trump, 89% of Democrats voted for Hillary Clinton, well, then there's not a whole lot of room there for actually people's vote choices to be affected. If we think it's things like, did people turn out and participate in elections? Those are also interesting questions, but we have to learn whether the extent to which is the case. There's also a kind of flowering information, a new literature that people are doing very interesting research in, which is to try to understand the effect of corrections of disinformation. When we were being told that information we heard previously was false, do we then correctly update? And if we don't correctly update, can we as social scientists understand why some people may be more likely to correctly update than other people will be to correctly update? Finally, there's a whole lot of information, a lot of interest in bots and trolls, and we've been doing a lot of work on this in my lab. But again, we're trying to figure out, can we find bots? Can we find trolls? What were bots doing? What were trolls doing? But we don't actually, again, know the answer to the question of what's the effect of exposure to bots and trolls. Maybe it turns out that being exposed to these automated accounts or these accounts who are pretending to be someone they're not is actually the same as being exposed to a normal account by a regular human being. But maybe it's not. So this is a large set of questions that we have to be thinking about as well. Now, we can also think about a different set of questions, which are questions about sort of different platforms in media. So this is, I think, this can be particularly important for those of you who are starting this project now and thinking about what it is that you're going to be studying while you're doing this. So one of the things that the early social media research has been characterized by is the fact that so much of it has been done on Twitter. And in some ways, that's been very useful because you have a lot of research you can compare to each other. Twitter is especially relevant platform for politics. There's a lot of people who are on Twitter, but of course, there's not nearly as many people who are on Twitter as there are on Facebook. And more generally, it's the case that that individuals actually don't exist only on one platform. If any of you have seen the latest research from Pew Research, they have these incredible figures where they look at who's on what platforms and how that correlates and overlaps with each other's. And so people actually kind of live in a multi-platform universe. And if we go beyond just thinking about social media, people don't just consume social media, news about politics on social media. They also may consume news about politics on television, on Fox News. They may consume about news about politics on traditional forms of media. So individuals tend to live in a cross-platform world, whether we're thinking cross-platform within social media or more broadly cross-media platforms. And yet almost all of our research has been taking place on Twitter. And that's, of course, and I'll come back to this in 1 second, because Twitter has been generally great about making data available in ways that other platforms hasn't. The other thing you'll find is that the vast majority of research to date on disinformation and all of these things have to do with text, right? People reading information in words. But of course, we're seeing more and more of a rise of images. For those of you who know about memes, the sort of rise of memes, the rise of platforms that focus particularly on images like Instagram. And images aren't even the end of the story, right? They're the beginning of the story, because we're getting into this world where we're going to have disinformation coming in the form of video. And in particular, if you haven't heard of deepfakes, you should make yourself aware of them. This is this ability to take videos and get people to say things and do things that they weren't doing actually. Now, there's a bit of a debate in the community about whether deepfakes are the huge new problem or they're being overstated as a problem, but there's certainly something about which we have very little research that's been done to date. We found very little in our review comparing the difference about being exposed to disinformation through video and through images as opposed to text. So that's an area in which we need a lot more. The other things, I couldn't really come up with a category for the last two things that we mentioned in the report, but one thing that all of us noticed is that there was quite a lot of research in the United States, less so outside the United States. So one big question is whether the generalizability of US findings to the rest of the world is going to hold. And then finally, it seems we actually have less, we don't have very much research at all about the role played by politicians in spreading disinformation. And this seems like this is going to be increasingly consequential as we move forward, especially if we begin to think that disinformation campaigns, whereas they were sort of brought to the fore by the idea that this could be foreign interference in another country's elections, my sense is that going forward, the bigger issue is going to be the lasting legacy of the 2016 Russian interference in the US elections is not going to be so much that it's a tool for foreign interference, although we have to watch that, but that it actually just exposed a huge number of tools that can be used by domestic political actors, who are, after all, the ones who are going to care the most about election results. I remember being interviewed by someone about the Mexican elections and being asked, did I think the Russians were interfering in the Mexican elections that took place after the US elections? And my answer was, maybe. I don't really know what the Russians are doing. I don't know if the Russians have an incentive to interfere in the Mexican elections, but the people who have an incentive to interfere in the Mexican elections are Mexicans. And I think that's where we're kind of headed. And I think to the extent that we begin to see these kind of disinformation campaigns around elections that are tied more to domestic actors, we're going to have to think very, very carefully about the role of politicians play in spreading this disinformation. Finally, and we're running, I don't want to run too over time, and I guess you guys are already running a little bit late there, but we also in the report identified data gaps. And these are things that are going to, if the last few slides were opportunities for what you were doing, these are going to be challenges. And the biggest problem is, if we start with this here, is that the reason there's so much research on Twitter data is because Twitter data has been relatively easy for scholars to get access to. And that's because most people's tweets are in the public domain. But it may be the case increasingly that we care about social media for its political impacts, and the social media platforms that we care about, when people are posting on those platforms, they're not doing so with the expectation that it's going to be public. So that's like most of Facebook or Instagram, or search data on Google, or even more so, even though it's not on the slide, we didn't talk about it in the report, but has become a bigger deal since then, WhatsApp, which is not only, WhatsApp data is not only made with the expectation that's private, it's actually encrypted data. So one of the most exciting things going on right now is an initiative called Social Science One under the purview of Gary King and Nate Persily, and I'll caveat with this by saying I'm the chair of one of the advisory committees to Social Science One, but this is a huge effort to try to open up some of this proprietary data to access by researchers. Of course, that leads to all sorts of concerns around privacy, and so there's a sort of big story that's going on there, where on the one hand, we're trying to think about whether what is going to be learned from all this social media analysis is going to remain in the hands of large public companies, or if it's going to be, learnings and findings that go into the public domain versus these kind of privacy concerns. And I'm happy to talk more to anyone about this. We also, we lack simple access to even things that are sort of public social media data, tweets that are put out in the public, things that are put into the public, like Twitter, Reddit, 8chan, and 4chan. And so we mentioned this in the report, although since the report was published, there's a website called pushshift.io, which you should check out, which is doing a really interesting job of making Reddit data and Gab data available as well. One of the most exciting things we've been able to do in our lab was link survey data to social media data. There's not much of this out there, and of course it does create all sorts of, it's gotten much more complicated in the sort of post-Cambridge Analytica world, but this is another area that we could use much more of as social scientists. As I said before, cross-platform social media usage data. We need better validated measures of online information consumption. Other things that would be incredibly helpful would be common archives of bots and trolls so that people who are trying to study these phenomena can draw on the research that's done. And we have to give a huge shout out to Twitter that's made available this troll data set from primarily the 2016 elections, but they seem to keep releasing this data. It'd be wonderful to see other platforms doing this as well. As I said, we'd like to be able to begin to start studying the effect of elites on the sharing of disinformation. And real-time data on emerging disinformation in the public domain would be really great for research. At the moment, this is all sort of within the platforms as it's occurring. Going to this question of videos and images, you might want to think about the idea of having archives of political videos and images that people could use to develop tools for studying disinformation. And finally, one of the things you'll find is if you get into this world, is that it also kind of comes headfirst with the growing and the admirable growing trend within social sciences to make sure that data results are reproducible, which means sharing your data with trying to use this data, which, as we've said, is private data and is proprietary data in the hands of these platforms and companies. And so thinking about how you might have something like a replication archive for social media studies that is the platform's consent to having the data posted publicly so that other scholars can use it to replicate findings, but in a way that's safe and secure, is another big question that's out there. And then finally, since we've accented the report, Twitter, which I think was the real hero of making more data publicly available for researchers, has begun to walk back on this a little bit, although it remains to be seen how much. So I think even though we think that having so many studies on Twitter data is not, it's not the optimal situation, it has been fantastic that with so much Twitter data available for research, and we want to make sure that continues in the future. So thank you very much for your time. You can download the paper you can download this report either from the Hewlett Foundation or from SSRN. Both of those are open access, and I hope you'll find it helpful as you begin to think through the questions that you're interested in studying, and I look forward to continuing the conversation with you. So thanks very much for your time.
Josh, thank you so much. That is an excellent assessment of the opportunities for research. It's a wonderful way to tee up our breakout sessions. I hope we can get you down here sometime soon to consult with us on all of this. So thank you so much. We appreciate your time today.
It's my pleasure, and looking forward to continuing the conversation.
Thank you. So that's our program for today. And I hope that we have piqued some ideas, catalyzed your thinking about work related to this that you might like to do, possible partnerships and collaborations. That's what we want to talk about in the breakout sessions. So I hope you will stay to participate in those. We have 3 sessions today. The breakout session on media and communications is going to be led by Dr. Annie Neiman, who just left. Okay. She was sitting right there. She'll be back. The session on cognition and behavior is being led by Dr. Chris McCarty. Would you raise your hand, please? And the session on technology and platforms or networks is led by Dr. Juan Gilbert. And we had a slide. Let me see if I can get us to that. There you go. So media and communication, President's Ballroom, BC. Which side is that? This side. So Annie, media and communications folks over here. Cognition and behavior, Chris McCarty in President's Ballroom A. You're over here. And technology and networks with Juan Gilbert in the Warrington room, which is right across the hallway here. So I hope you will participate. We're going to be reaching out with a post-symposium survey. We want to get your reaction and also try to determine what your interests are. If you want to continue to participate in the consortium in some way, let us know how that might look, what that might be like for you, so that we can begin to set up the infrastructure that will accommodate the work you want to do. We talked about the pilot project program, the $50,000. You should have information. Did they get the handouts, Randy, on the? Okay, they're out on the table. Please grab those and take a look. We will be offering more funding programs as time goes on. This is the one to get us started, so please seriously consider that. And don't forget to stay afterward. We have a reception downstairs, courtesy of the foundation, and it is more than punch. So I hope you'll stay. A little incentive to participate in the breakout sessions. So with that, why don't we divvy up and continue the conversation? Thanks everybody for coming.